On the morning of October 14th, a man named Harlan Whitfield stood in the middle of a Tennessee field and felt something he had not felt in 30 years. Not fear exactly, not panic, something quieter and more unsettling than either of those things. He felt lost. And for a man who had spent 3 decades building an empire by always knowing exactly what to do next, that feeling sat in his chest like a stone he could not put down. The John Deere 9R sat in the center of the main field the way a monument sits in a town square, still, heavy, indifferent to everything around it. $95,000 of green metal and German engineering, 16 months old, under warranty, serviced on schedule, maintained with the same obsessive attention Harlan brought to every asset he owned. The engine turned over clean and strong every single time someone tried to start it. The hydraulic gauges read perfect across every system. There were no warning lights, no error codes, no alarms of any kind. The machine simply would not move, not 1 inch, not for any amount of money or expertise or determination that Harlan Whitfield could direct at it. 19 days it had been sitting there. 19 days of harvest window closing like a slow door, and the weather coming in from the west, carrying the kind of rain that did not care about a man's schedule, or his losses, or the particular weight of silence that had settled over this property like fog over river bottom land. Harlan stood with his hands in the pockets of his jacket and looked at the machine, the way a man looks at a problem that has stopped cooperating with his usual approach. The October light came clean and sharp across the field, casting long shadows from the equipment shed and turning the dew on the grass into something that almost looked deliberate, like the land itself was trying to tell him something he did not have the vocabulary to understand yet. He was 62 years old, silver at the temples, lines around his eyes earned through decades of early mornings and hard decisions, and the particular discipline required to build something real from nothing. He stood 6 feet tall in worn leather boots that had walked 100 construction sites and twice that many conference rooms, and he wore the bearing of a man who had learned long ago that confidence was not something you felt, it was something you decided. You put it on in the morning the way you put on your jacket. You wore it because the alternative was to let the room see you uncertain, and uncertain men did not close deals. But there was no deal to close here. There was no room to walk into with his chin up and his checkbook ready. There was just a field and a machine and 19 days of failure stacked up like cordwood behind him. Let me tell you about Harlan Whitfield, because a man like this deserves to be understood before you judge the decisions he made. He grew up on a farm outside Chattanooga, the only son of Franklin Whitfield, who worked 340 acres of mixed cropland with the same equipment from 1 decade to the next, and never once complained about what he did not have. Franklin Whitfield was not a complicated man. He rose before the sun, and he worked until the light was gone, and he believed with the quiet certainty of someone who had never been persuaded otherwise that most problems could be solved if you paid close enough attention to them. He had hands that looked like they had been shaped by the work they did, thick and capable and marked by decades of grease and soil and small cuts that healed crooked. He never hired a mechanic in his life. He fixed what broke himself, or he had his son hand him tools while he lay on his back in the dirt and figured it out by sound and touch and the accumulated knowledge of a man who had spent 40 years listening to machines tell him where they hurt. Harlan had watched his father do this his entire childhood, and had learned from it the way you learn the things that are shown to you before you are old enough to choose what to pay attention to. He absorbed it without knowing he was absorbing it. the patience, the listening, the particular kind of attention that treated a broken thing not as a problem to be solved by someone else, but as a question being asked directly of you. Then he turned 25 and he left. It was 1987, and Nashville was a different city than it is today, hungry and growing and full of the kind of opportunity that a young man with a sharp mind and nothing to lose could recognize from a distance. Harlan had $800 in a checking account, and a truck that burned oil, and a clarity of purpose that he had been building since his first year of college, when he realized that what he was actually studying was not business administration, but rather the mechanics of how wealth moved from one set of hands to another, and why some men always seemed to be standing on the right side of that transaction. He bought his first distressed property in 1989, sold it 14 months later for a profit that changed the number in his checking account from something embarrassing to something that opened doors. He bought 2 more, then 5. He learned to read a market the way his father had taught him to read weather, by watching patterns nobody else was watching and trusting what the patterns told him even when the room disagreed. He built a reputation for being right about things before other people understood they were wrong. He built a company. He built a life in Nashville that looked nothing like the one he had left behind in Chattanooga, and he told himself for 30 years that this was the point. He bought the Tennessee property 5 years ago. 1,200 acres of bottomland and upland field 40 minutes outside of Nashville, which he described to his partners as a serious investment and to himself as something he was less willing to examine. He was not sentimental about it. He did not tell himself he was coming home to something. He told himself it was a diversified asset with long-term appreciation potential and predictable yield if managed properly, and he hired Boyd Hardin to manage it properly and equipped it with the best machinery available and set it up to run like a business, because everything Harlan Whitfield touched ran like a business. That was the system. That was how it worked. Boyd Hardin had been managing this property since Harlan bought it. 42 years old, raised on a farm outside Lexington, Kentucky, where his father had taught him that machines were not mysteries but conversations, and that the man who listened carefully enough would always understand what was being said. Boyd had the kind of competence that does not announce itself. He fixed problems before they reached his employer's desk. He made decisions that were right 9 times out of 10, and was honest about the 10th. He knew this land the way a man knows land. He has walked every season for 5 years, which is to say, he knew it the way you know something that has taught you things you did not go looking to learn. On the first morning of October harvest, Boyd had walked out to the main field at 6:30 in the morning and found the John Deere sitting silent. He had run through the obvious checks. Fluid levels, battery hydraulic pressure, all of it reading exactly as it should. He had tried the engine 3 times. It turned over clean and strong and produced exactly the sound of a machine that was working perfectly, which made the absolute stillness of everything afterward more confusing rather than less. Boyd Hardin had been around machines long enough to know that there were 2 kinds of problems. There were the problems that announced themselves clearly, that showed up in gauges and codes and made themselves available to diagnosis through the proper channels. And there were the other kind. The problems that hid themselves in the places nobody thought to look because nobody had needed to look there yet. The problems that required not better equipment but different knowledge, the kind of knowledge that came from having been shown something by someone who learned it the hard way in a time before diagnostic software existed to do the showing. Boyd thought he knew where this problem was hiding. Secondary access panel left rear below the wheel housing, a small valve in a circuit that did not appear on standard service checklists, because the engineers who wrote those checklists had considered it too fundamental to mention. He had seen something like this once before a decade ago on a different machine on a different property. The man who had shown him what to look for was a retired engineer named Everett Kane, who lived about 12 miles down County Road 7 and charged almost nothing for his time because he did not need the money and had stopped caring about money around the same time his wife died. Boyd had mentioned Everett Kane to Harlan on the first morning. Harlan had nodded, thanked him, and called the John Deere dealership. This is the thing about a system that has always worked. It does not feel like a limitation. It feels like competence. It feels like being the kind of person who knows how to solve problems because the system has solved every problem you have ever brought to it, and so the system and your identity have become the same thing without you noticing. When Harlan Whitfield called the dealership, he was not dismissing Boyd Hardin. He was doing what successful people do. He was finding the right expert and engaging them appropriately. The fact that an answer had already been offered to him and he had not heard it did not register as a failure of listening. It registered as the normal functioning of a man who knew how to delegate. Burl McKay arrived the following morning in a service truck that was cleaner than most people's cars. 45 years old, John Deere certified with 20 years of experience and the easy confidence of someone who had been the person with the answers in enough rooms to mistake that position for a permanent state of being. He carried diagnostic equipment that filled the bed of the truck in a manner that communicated without saying anything directly, that whatever the previous person had thought about this problem was probably not worth examining too carefully. He set up his equipment with the efficiency of long practice. Boyd stood nearby. Burl did not ask Boyd what he thought. The exchange of credentials, visible and invisible, had already established who was the expert in this situation, and Boyd Hardin's worn jacket and calloused hands did not suggest expertise of the kind that came with certificates. Burl worked for 3 hours. His equipment beeped and clicked and displayed readings on screens that glowed blue in the October morning. He replaced 2 control modules and rewired a connection that his diagnostics flagged as marginally out of specification. He was methodical and professional and gave every impression of a man who was approaching a solvable problem in the correct way. The bill was $1,850. The tractor did not move. Burl stood beside the machine with his hands on his hips and the first small cracks of uncertainty showing in his expression. He told Harlan he would come back the next morning with different parts. Sometimes control modules were defective straight from the factory. It happened. The data pointed here, so he would follow where the data pointed. Harlan wrote the check. That evening he sat at the kitchen table while his wife Lorene moved through the familiar rhythms of making dinner, and he did not tell her how the day had gone because the set of his shoulders had already told her, and there was nothing useful in saying the words out loud yet. Lorene Whitfield was 60 years old, retired 2 years from teaching high school English in Nashville, and she had the particular perceptiveness of a woman who had spent 35 years listening to what her husband said while watching what he meant. She put dinner on the table and sat across from him, and let the silence be what it was. The next morning, Burl returned with a case full of components. He worked for 5 hours. He replaced the transmission control unit and 2 hydraulic actuators and a pressure sensor that had registered as clean but that his updated analysis suggested might be intermittently faulty. The parts cost $950. The labor brought the second visit to $1,200. The tractor remained exactly as immobile as before. Burl climbed down from the cab with his confidence fractured in ways he was trying not to show. He said he was stumped. He said everything should be working. He said the honest recommendation was to get a second opinion, because sometimes fresh eyes caught what experienced ones missed, and sometimes the problem was in a place nobody expected. He drove away. Harlan stood in the field with the total cost of 2 visits adding up to just under $5,000 and the machine still not moving and the harvest window still closing, and something in his chest that was not quite the feeling he had been trained to recognize as a problem, because it was not fear and it was not anger and it was not even frustration in the ordinary sense. It was something colder and quieter. The first small vibration of a system beginning to develop a crack. He did not tell Boyd what he thought about any of this. He thanked him for standing by during both visits, and went back to his office and made 4 calls to Nashville that he should have made yesterday. The day moved forward. The tractor sat still. The weather came a little closer from the west. That evening, for the first time since the machine stopped working, Harlan did not go back to his office after dinner. He walked out to the barn instead, moved past the tools and equipment in the familiar dark, found the bottle of bourbon he kept on the shelf above the workbench, and poured 2 fingers into a cup that had been sitting there since he could not remember when. He sat on a wooden stool and looked at nothing in particular and drank the bourbon slowly, and did not think about Nashville or the investments or the quarterly projections he had promised 2 partners by Friday. He just sat with the particular quiet of a barn at night and let himself feel the weight of what was happening without trying to move it yet. He did not know that on the other side of the property, in the small house at the end of the gravel drive that Harlan provided for his foreman, Boyd Hardin was sitting at his own kitchen table with a sheet of paper in front of him that had 3 lines written on it and nothing else. The 3 lines were the beginning of a letter of resignation. Boyd had written the first line on day 3. He had written the second on day 7. Tonight he had written the third. Each time he had folded the paper and put it in the drawer and not sent it. Each time Lorene Whitfield had called him within a day of his writing it, not because she knew about the letter, but because she had the radar that certain women develop for the people her husband depended on most and was least equipped to appreciate. Boyd had not told Harlan what he thought about any of this either, not because he was a man who gave up easily, because he had told him. He had offered the answer on the first morning, and the answer had been heard and set aside, and Boyd understood that telling a man something he is not ready to hear is different from reaching him. You could speak clearly into a room where no one was listening and call it communication, or you could wait until the room became quiet enough that your words had somewhere to land. Boyd was waiting. He just was not sure he could keep waiting indefinitely. Denton Hale came down from Memphis on day 8. Master Technician certification, a reputation that preceded him by several counties, the kind of methodical confidence that belonged to someone who had dismantled and rebuilt enough machines to understand them the way a surgeon understands a body. He arrived with a van full of equipment and a consultant from the regional dealership who took notes and said very little and looked at everything twice. They spent a full day. Denton diagnosed a hydraulic pump failure that manifested in ways his equipment registered as subclinical, but that his experience told him was the culprit. He ordered parts from a dealer 2 counties over. The parts arrived on schedule the following morning. The installation was meticulous. Every connection checked twice. Every seal properly torqued. The diagnostic after installation showed all systems green. Denton started the engine and engaged the drive controls. Nothing. He ran the diagnostic again. Green across every panel. He ran it a third time. The tractor sat in the field as if it had grown roots there, as if movement were a concept it had decided not to participate in anymore. Denton climbed down and stood beside the machine with his hands at his sides and the expression of a man delivering news he had not expected to be delivering. He said he was sorry. He said the repair cost had reached a level where it was approaching replacement value, and his professional recommendation, offered with genuine reluctance, was to consider scrapping the machine and purchasing new. Harlan kept his voice level. He had been keeping his voice level for 8 days. He asked Denton to explain to him how a 14-month-old machine under manufacturer warranty was being recommended for scrap. Denton said sometimes machines failed catastrophically without obvious reason. He said it was rare, but it happened. He said there was no pattern, no logic, just bad timing and bad luck, and the uncomfortable reality that sophisticated equipment was sophisticated in its failures as well as its operations. Harlan wrote the check. $3,200. He watched Denton Hale drive away down the county road and stood in the field for a long time after the sound of the van had faded, and the number in his head was not the 3,200, but the total, and the total was getting toward $8,000, and the machine had not moved a single inch, and 11 days of harvest were gone. And the word that kept surfacing in the back of his mind was the one he had spent 30 years learning not to use about himself. Wrong. Have you ever been in a position where everything you knew how to do turned out not to be the thing that needed doing? Not because your methods were foolish, not because your instincts were poor, but because the particular problem in front of you required a kind of knowledge that lived somewhere your system did not reach. Have you ever watched a gap open up between what you know and what is needed and felt the specific disorientation of realizing those two things have become different things without your noticing? That is where Harlan Whitfield was standing on day 11. In a field in Tennessee, surrounded by land he owned and equipment that was failing him, and expertise he had paid for and was not receiving, feeling for the first time in a very long time the particular altitude sickness of a man whose confidence has climbed higher than his understanding. He did not call Boyd that evening. He sat in his office with his spreadsheets and his Nashville files and tried to think his way around the problem. The way he thought his way around every problem by finding the angle nobody else had identified and approaching from there. He looked at the tractor documentation. He called the dealership and spoke to the service manager for 30 minutes and was told professionally and regretfully that the diagnostic findings from Denton Hale aligned with their own remote assessment and that the situation was unusual but not unheard of. He was offered a partial trade-in credit toward a replacement unit. He thanked them and ended the call and sat in the silence of his office and did not feel any better about anything. Cody Marsh arrived on day 12 with 2 assistants who moved with the careful precision of people who had been trained to think of themselves as part of something cutting edge. 34 years old, the youngest of anyone Harlan had called, already building a reputation as the generation's answer to old-school diagnostics. He charged $400 per hour and was said to solve problems that other technicians could not even identify, which was the particular promise that Harlan Whitfield needed to believe in right now. The setup took 40 minutes. Laptop computers networked to sensors attached to every accessible point of the machine. AI-assisted diagnostics that process data in patterns no human eye could follow at that speed. Cody walked a slow circle around the tractor before touching it, looking at it the way someone looks at a system rather than a machine, as if the problem existed in the relationship between components rather than in any single component itself. His confidence was the particular variety that does not feel the need to establish itself through contempt, which made it more unsettling in some ways than Burl Mackay's had been. He simply assumed he would find what the others had not found because he had equipment the others had not had, and in his experience that equation always resolved in one direction. 3 hours passed. The wind shifted and brought the smell of rain that was still 2 days away but coming regardless of anyone's preferences. Cody and his assistants rotated through the data on their screens with the focused quiet of people working at the edge of what their instruments could tell them. Boyd appeared with coffee at noon. Cody took it without looking up. When Cody finally straightened and closed his laptop, it was with the careful deliberation of someone who had arrived at something he was not certain how to say. He walked to where Harlan stood, and he said he was not going to charge for the day. He said that all four of the previous technicians, himself included, had looked at this machine through the same lens, which was the lens of current diagnostic capability, and that lens had limits. He said the diagnostics were showing him a machine that should be running and was not running, and the gap between those two things existed in a place his equipment was not designed to reach. Then he paused, and he said something that Harlan would think about for a long time afterward. He said the problem was either buried deep enough that finding it would cost more than the machine was worth, or it was something so simple that it had escaped everyone, precisely because it was simple, because sophisticated tools trained sophisticated eyes, and sophisticated eyes learned where to look and where not to look in ways that became habits before they became limitations. He refused payment. He drove away with his assistants and his equipment and his $400 per hour sitting unpaid in whatever account it would otherwise have gone into, and what he left behind was a silence that was qualitatively different from all the silences that had preceded it. Harlan stood in the field after Cody Marsh drove away and pressed both hands flat against the cold metal of the tractor and held them there without speaking. Not because he thought the gesture would accomplish anything, because he was out of things to accomplish and he needed somewhere to put his hands. The total was past $10,000 now. 19 days since it had stopped working. Actually, he thought. Not quite 19. 18. Day 18 was tomorrow. He was already counting wrong. He went inside. He went past the kitchen where Laureen was reading and past the living room where the evening news was saying things that no longer seemed very urgent, and down the stairs to the basement where he kept the files for the property. He was looking for the purchase contract, for the warranty documentation, for something in the language of the original sale that might give him a number to call or a clause to invoke or any mechanism at all for transferring this problem out of his hands and into someone else's. He found the files in the second box. He pulled them out and set them on the workbench under the basement light and went through them page by page. The warranty language was clear and the coverage was genuine, and the process for filing a claim required documentation from a certified technician, which he now had in abundance, and he would pursue it, and it would probably result in some recovery of the costs he had incurred, and none of that felt like the point anymore. He set the warranty documents aside and reached back into the box for the service records, and his hand found something else first. something that had no reason to be there in a box of farm purchase documents from 5 years ago, unless someone had put it there without thinking about it, or unless it had been moved at some point and landed in this box in the way that important things sometimes land in the wrong place and stay there waiting. It was small, smaller than he remembered. The cover was dark leather, cracked at the corners and soft from decades of handling, with no writing on the outside. His father's hands had held this. That was the first thing he understood when he picked it up before he even opened it. He could feel the age of it, the weight of it, the particular texture of something that had absorbed a long time. He held it for a moment without opening it. Franklin Whitfield had been dead for 9 years. The farm outside Chattanooga had been sold 6 years ago after his mother passed to a neighboring operation that folded it into their acreage and planted it in soybeans and removed the buildings within 2 years. There was nothing left of it that Harlan could point to. The land remained, obviously the land always remained, but the particular arrangement of things that had made it the place where he grew up was gone, in the way that places go when the people who defined them are no longer there. He opened the notebook. The handwriting on the first page was his father's, small and precise and slanting to the right, in the way of a man who had taught himself to write with more care than he had been taught. The date in the top corner was May of 1963. Harlan had been born in February of 1962. His father had been writing in this notebook when Harlan was barely old enough to sit up on his own. The first entry was about a tractor, an International Harvester, a model Harlan vaguely recognized from old photographs. The entry described a problem his father had been having with the machine and the process by which he had identified the source of the problem, which was not a process that involved any equipment more sophisticated than his own hands and his own ears and the accumulated understanding of a man who had been paying close attention to machines for 20 years. His father had written in the methodical way he wrote everything. The machine does not hide what is wrong with it. It only hides from people who are not listening. Harlan read that sentence twice. Then he closed the notebook and stood in the basement under the fluorescent light and held it in both hands and did not move for a long time. He carried it upstairs with him, past the kitchen, past Lorene, past the news that was still talking about things that did not matter. He put the notebook on the corner of his desk in his office and sat down and looked at it for a while without touching it again. Then he pulled his files toward him and tried to work. He could not work. He sat until past midnight without doing anything useful. The notebook sat in the corner of his desk the way it had been sitting in the corner of that box in the basement, waiting without urgency. Patient in the way that things are patient when they have already waited longer than you can imagine. He did not read the rest of it that night. He was not ready for the rest of it yet. What he did finally at 12:30 in the morning was walk upstairs to where Lorene was asleep and stand in the doorway of their bedroom in the dark. She did not wake. He listened to her breathe for a moment and then went back down and turned off the light in his office and sat in the dark with his hands on his desk and the notebook just there at the edge of where his fingers could reach if he chose to move them. Tomorrow, he decided he would call Sheila Vance. She was the independent specialist everyone in the regional network spoke about when they wanted to indicate that they had exhausted the standard options. She cost $500 just to show up and evaluate the situation, and that rate communicated something Harlan still found comforting, which was that serious money still bought serious expertise, and that somewhere on the other side of enough investment the answer would still appear. He would call Sheila Vance and he would find out what she found, and if she found nothing, he would think about what came next. He was not thinking yet about what Boyd Harden knew. He was not thinking about the 3 pieces of paper in the drawer in Boyd's house at the end of the gravel drive. He was not thinking about the 12 miles of county road that ran south from his property to where a 71-year-old man in a house that needed painting kept a toolbox that had followed him through 50 years of making broken things work again. He was thinking about tomorrow and Sheila Vance and the diminishing but not yet exhausted possibility that his system would still produce the answer he needed. The notebook sat in the corner of the desk. His father's handwriting waited inside it with the patience of something that has never been in a hurry, because the truth that is written down does not go anywhere. It simply waits for the person who needs to read it to get quiet enough to sit still. The October darkness settled over the Tennessee field outside. The John Deere sat unmoved in the center of the main field as it had sat for 18 days and would sit for one more, indifferent to everything and patient in its own way, the way a machine is patient when it has been waiting for someone to look in the right place. Sheila Vance arrived on the morning of day 19 with a tablet computer and diagnostic software that made Cody Marsh's setup look like something from a previous generation. She was 50 years old, independent, with 25 years of experience that showed not in her equipment, but in the way she moved around the machine, unhurried and systematic, touching things in a sequence that suggested she was following a logic she had developed over decades rather than a checklist someone else had written. She had driven up from Knoxville before 7 in the morning, and she charged $500 before she opened her bag, which Harlan had paid without hesitation, because the number still communicated something to him that he needed it to communicate. Lorene had watched from the porch with her coffee and said nothing. Boyd had stood near the equipment shed at the distance he always maintained when the certified professionals came, which was respectful enough not to crowd anyone and close enough to see everything. He had been maintaining that distance for 19 days. He had watched 4 men and now 1 woman approach this machine with their credentials and their equipment and their confidence, and he had watched every one of them arrive at the same place, which was the place where their tools stopped talking and the machine kept its silence. Sheila worked for 5 hours. She cross-referenced her own diagnostics against the reports from the previous 4 technicians, which Harlan had provided in a folder, because by this point he had learned to anticipate what the next person would ask for. She checked the electrical system and the hydraulic system and the transmission and the computer architecture with the methodical patience of someone who understood that thoroughness was not the same as speed. Every test came back clean. Every system reported itself as functional. The machine sat in the October light and produced through its gauges and its sensors and its diagnostic ports a comprehensive portrait of a piece of equipment that was working perfectly in every measurable way. She stood beside the tractor as the morning moved toward afternoon and looked at her tablet with an expression Harlan had not seen on any of the previous 4 faces. Not frustration, not the particular embarrassment of expensive failure, something more honest than either of those things. She told him that technically the machine should be running. She told him that there was something wrong that their diagnostic systems could not detect. She said it was either buried deep enough in the architecture that finding it would require dismantling the entire machine at a cost that would exceed replacement value, or it was something so fundamental that everyone had looked straight past it because nobody was trained to look for something that basic. She paused on that second possibility the way you pause on something you are not quite willing to say out loud. Harlan asked her to finish the thought. She said sometimes the answer was in the place nobody wanted to look, because looking there meant admitting the sophisticated approach had walked right past something simple. She said she did not know what that thing was. She said she was sorry. She refused to charge for the diagnostic time beyond the initial consultation fee, $2,400 for the privilege of the most honest answer anyone had given him, which was that nobody knew. She shook Harlan's hand and looked at him directly when she said goodbye, and there was something in her eyes that was not quite pity, but was adjacent to it. The expression of a competent person watching another competent person run out of the tools that have always worked. He watched her drive away down the county road and stood in the field with both hands at his sides and felt the total settle into him. $10,800, 19 days, 5 professionals, no answer. The harvest was not coming back. Whatever window had existed was closing now in the way that October windows close in Tennessee, which is to say, not dramatically but permanently, the season simply moving forward without asking anyone's permission or registering anyone's losses in its accounting. The neighboring properties had finished their harvest the week before. Harlan could see the evidence of it from his own fields, the cleared rows and the equipment sitting clean and stored against the coming cold, the particular tidiness of work completed that made his own situation more visible by contrast. He went inside. He sat at his desk. He did not touch the notebook in the corner. 2 days later, Tessa drove up from Atlanta without calling ahead. She arrived on a Saturday morning in a small car she had bought the year before and parked behind her mother's sedan and walked into the kitchen where Lorene was making breakfast with the focused energy of a woman who needed to do something useful. Tessa was 32, dark-haired like her mother with Harlan's chin and Lorene's eyes and the particular directness of a person who had grown up watching a self-made man and understood both the strength and the cost of that way of living. She worked in marketing for a firm in Atlanta that kept trying to put her into management she did not want, and she called every Sunday, and she had her mother's gift for asking the exact question you were not prepared to answer. She found Harlan in his office with files spread across his desk, and the expression he wore when he was solving a problem by refusing to accept that he had not yet solved it. She sat down without being invited and looked at him the way she had been looking at him since she was old enough to understand that looking carefully at the people you loved was a form of care. He told her the situation, not all of it. The condensed version that left out the 2 in the morning bourbon and the 3 times he had walked out to the field at dusk just to stand next to the machine and feel the weight of it. He told her the relevant facts. 5 technicians, the total cost, the harvest, the warranty claim he was pursuing. Tessa listened. She did not offer solutions. She sat with the information for a moment the way her mother sat with information, letting it settle before she responded to it. Then she asked why he had not asked Boyd what he thought. Harlan said Boyd managed the property. This was an engineering problem. Boyd was not an engineer. Tessa looked at him without changing her expression. She said he had taught her to follow data. She said the data showed 5 certified experts with advanced equipment had failed to solve this problem. She said that was data. She asked what the data was telling him. Harlan did not answer that question. Tessa did not push. She stayed through lunch talking with Lorene about Atlanta and work and the things daughters and mothers talk about when they are both paying attention to something else underneath the conversation. When she left that afternoon, she hugged her father at the door and held on for a moment longer than usual, and he felt in that extra second the particular weight of being known by someone who loves you anyway. He watched her car disappear down the drive and stood on the porch in the cold afternoon air and did not go back inside for a while. That evening, Lorene told him about Boyd. She told him the way she told him things she had been holding for a while directly and without softening it more than was necessary. She told him that Boyd Hardin had written a letter of resignation 3 times in the past 2 weeks. She told him that she had called Boyd each time to ask how he was doing, not knowing about the letter, and that Boyd had stayed. She told him that she did not think Boyd would stay much longer. Harlan was quiet for a long time. He asked her how she knew about the letters. She said she did not know about the letters, not specifically. She said she knew Boyd, and she knew what it looked like when a good person was running out of reasons to stay in a situation where they were not being heard. She said she recognized it because she had learned to recognize it in other situations over the course of 35 years. The implication of that landed where it was meant to land. Harlan went to his office. He sat at his desk in the dark for a while without turning the light on. Then he turned it on and looked at the notebook in the corner, and this time he picked it up. He opened it to the beginning and read slowly, the way you read something when you are finally willing to let it take its time. His father's voice came off the page in the way that a voice you have known your entire life comes off the page, not as text, but as presence, as the particular cadence of a man who chose his words carefully because he did not have many to waste. Franklin Whitfield had been a spare man in most ways, spare with money, spare with complaint, spare with the expression of feeling in any form that was not practical action. But he had written in this notebook alone over years, and what he had written was different from how he had spoken, fuller, more considered, as if the notebook was the place where he allowed himself to think out loud in a way that ordinary life did not make room for. Harlan read through the early entries, machine problems and their solutions, observations about soil and weather notes on the behavior of specific pieces of equipment across different seasons. His father had been a meticulous observer. He had written down what he noticed and what he inferred from what he noticed and what he did as a result and whether it had worked. The entries read like a conversation with himself, a man thinking through problems by writing them down in the faith that clarity would come from articulation. There were entries about Harlan, not many. His father had not been a man who wrote about people the way he wrote about machines. But they were there, brief observations about a boy he was watching grow into something. Harlan read one entry from 1974, when he had been 12 years old, in which his father described watching him fix a broken fence post, and noted that the boy had done it correctly without being shown because he had been paying attention the 2 previous times. His father had written in his small, precise hand that the boy understood things before he understood them, which was the best kind of understanding, the kind that lived in the hands before it lived in the head. Harlan sat with that for a moment. He kept reading. The entries grew sparser through the 1980s as the farm took more and the time for writing took less. There were gaps of months, sometimes longer. The handwriting changed subtly across the years the way handwriting changes when a person ages and the hands that hold the pen accumulate more use. The observations remained precise. The voice remained the same. He turned pages slowly, not rushing toward the end, but the end was there and eventually he reached it. The last entry was dated September 1987. Harlan had left for Nashville in March of that year with his $800 and his truck and his clarity of purpose. His father had watched him go without saying much, which was how his father did most things. He had shaken Harlan's hand at the end of the driveway and told him to pay attention, and then had gone back to the barn to finish what he had been doing before the goodbyes had interrupted him. Harlan had not understood that his father had meant the handshake as a full expression of everything he felt about the departure. He had been 25 and looking forward, and the brevity of the goodbye had felt like confirmation that he was making the right choice, that his father approved of the direction that the farm and the man who worked it would be fine without him, and that everyone understood this and accepted it. He had not understood because he had been 25 and looking forward that brevity in a man like Franklin Whitfield was not the absence of feeling but the compressed form of it. The last entry read, "The boy has gone to Nashville and I think he will do well there because he has a good head and he knows how to work and he understands money in a way I never did and never needed to. I am proud of him in the way a man is proud when what he made goes on to be more than he made it to be. But I have been thinking tonight about what I did not say to him before he left because there was not a way to say it that would have landed right on a morning when he was 25 years old and pointed at a horizon. So I am writing it down instead. The boy has a good head. I just hope he does not forget that a good head means nothing if you stop listening to the people standing right next to you. All the machinery in the world will not tell you what a good man standing beside you already knows. I have tried to teach him this. I hope it took." Harlan read that paragraph 3 times. He sat in his office at 11:30 at night with the notebook open in his hands and the lamp making a circle of light on his desk and the rest of the room in darkness, and he did not move for a long time. The house was quiet around him. Outside the Tennessee night was cold and clear, and somewhere in the field the John Deere sat in the dark, as it had sat for 19 days, patient with the patience of a machine that does not know it is waiting for anything but is waiting nonetheless. His father had written those words 37 years ago. He had owned this notebook for 9 years since his father died, and the estate was settled and the belongings distributed, and in 9 years he had never read the last page. He had put it in a box with farm documents because it seemed like it belonged with things related to the farm, and he had carried that box to 3 different properties over the years, and he had never opened it because it was the kind of thing a person keeps meaning to read and does not read, not because they do not care, but because they are always pointed at a horizon, and the things waiting in boxes require a stillness that horizons do not encourage. He closed the notebook carefully. He set it on the desk in front of him where he could see it. Then he sat there in the quiet and let himself understand what the last 2.5 weeks had actually been. Not a mechanical failure, not a diagnostic challenge, not a problem that required better equipment or more credentials or a higher hourly rate. A question. The same question his father had been asking him for 37 years, written down in September of 1987 in a notebook that had been waiting in a box for 9 years for Harlan Whitfield to get quiet enough to read it. Are you listening to the people standing right next to you? He thought about Boyd Hardin. He thought about the morning the machine stopped working when Boyd had come to him with a name and a suggestion, and Harlan had heard it the way you hear something you have already decided is not the answer. He thought about the 5 professional opinions he had purchased since then, and what they had collectively produced, which was $10,800 of confirmed ignorance. He thought about the 3 letters Boyd had written and not sent. He thought about what it cost a man to stay in a situation where he was not being heard, and he thought about the particular kind of loyalty that staying anyway represented. He thought about what his father would have done on the first morning. He already knew the answer to that. His father would have asked Boyd what he thought. His father would have asked Boyd on day one, and listened to what Boyd said, and driven down County Road 7 with the problem stated clearly, and come home with the answer before the sun was high. His father would never have called a dealership. His father would have understood in the bones and the hands and the accumulated instinct of a man who had spent 50 years paying attention that the person standing closest to the problem was more likely to see it clearly than the person arriving from a distance with expensive tools. Harlan had left the farm to get away from the limitations of that approach. He had built his empire by knowing when to hire specialists, when to pay for expertise, when to trust the credentials and the certificates and the hourly rates that indicated seriousness. That knowledge had made him. It was real knowledge, and it had produced real results, and he was not wrong to have learned it. But he had learned it so thoroughly that he had stopped knowing when not to apply it. He had let it become the whole system rather than one tool in a larger one. He had turned his father's lesson not upside down but sideways, and the angle of that mistake had been invisible to him until a broken machine and a notebook and a paragraph written in September 1987 had made it suddenly and completely visible. He went to bed after midnight. He lay in the dark beside Laureen and listened to her breathe and thought about what he was going to do in the morning. Let me tell you about Everett Kane, because a man like this deserves to be understood before he arrives on the page. He was born in 1953 in Chattanooga, Tennessee, the youngest of 4 children in a family where money was something other people had, and the absence of it was not discussed as a hardship, but simply lived as a condition of the world. His father worked construction, and his mother worked at the textile plant on the east side of town. And Everett grew up understanding that the distance between where you were and where you wanted to be was measured not in luck, but in the quality of your attention. He was good at mathematics in the way that made his teachers stop him after class and ask questions. He was better at physics. He had a mind that moved naturally toward systems, toward the logic of how things connected and what happened when connections failed. And by the time he was 16, he had taken apart and reassembled every piece of machinery on the property they rented outside of town with a fluency that suggested understanding rather than mechanical familiarity. He got a scholarship to Georgia Tech and arrived in Atlanta in the fall of 1971 as the first person in his family to set foot on a university campus, and he found there that the language he had been speaking his whole life, the language of forces and pressures and the behavior of materials under stress, had a formal grammar he had never been taught but immediately recognized. He graduated summa laude in 1975 with a degree in mechanical engineering and 3 job offers. He took the one from Caterpillar because they were building agricultural equipment at their Tennessee plant, and Tennessee was home, and he was not sentimental about most things, but he was about that. He started as a junior engineer and found within the first year that his particular aptitude was hydraulic systems, the circuits through which pressure moved and work was done and failures propagated in ways that were logical once you understood the logic and counterintuitive until you did. He had a gift for it, not just for designing systems that functioned correctly, but for imagining the ways they might fail, the places where stress would accumulate and materials would fatigue and small obstructions would produce outsized consequences downstream. 30 years at Caterpillar. He worked his way to lead engineer for agricultural hydraulics, a position that meant his designs went into machines that worked fields across 6 continents, and he held patents in his own name for solutions to problems that had been considered standard limitations of the technology until he rethought them. He trained the engineers who came after him with the same thoroughness his teachers had brought to him, and he wrote a curriculum for regional training programs that was used across Tennessee and Kentucky for more than a decade, teaching working mechanics the principles behind the systems they maintained. The curriculum was thorough. It covered every standard failure mode in every major system across the equipment lines that mattered to regional farmers. It was the product of 3 decades of accumulated understanding, and he was proud of it, and it served the people who learned from it well. There was one thing it did not include: the secondary hydraulic circuit in the left rear of certain machine configurations, and specifically the small pressure regulation valve deep in that circuit, had been excluded from the curriculum because when Everett wrote the training materials, he considered that valve so fundamental, so basic to the earliest understanding of the system that including it in a technical curriculum felt like including instructions for turning a key in an ignition. It was the kind of thing you knew before you started. It was the kind of thing that was obvious once someone had shown it to you, and everyone who had been through the original training had been shown it. And so it was not in the written materials because written materials were for the things that needed explaining. What Everett had not fully accounted for was what happened to knowledge that was considered too obvious to write down. It did not persist the way written knowledge persisted. It transferred person to person through demonstration and conversation, and when the people who had demonstrated it retired or moved on or died, the knowledge went with them, and what was left was the written curriculum with its careful explanations of every system except the one that did not need explaining, and a generation of trained technicians who were excellent at everything the curriculum covered and had a gap in exactly the place the curriculum had chosen to trust to common knowledge. Everett had figured this out about 4 years after he retired when a farmer called him about a machine problem his certified technician could not solve, and Everett had driven over and found the issue in 20 minutes in a place the technician had not thought to look. And the technician had looked at him with an expression that told Everett the gap in the curriculum was not just a gap, but a systematic absence that had been producing systematic failures for years. He had not gone back to Caterpillar to fix the curriculum. He was retired and they did not need him, and bureaucracies move at their own speed regardless of urgency. What he had done instead was make himself available. He lived alone in a house that needed painting on County Road 7, and he drove a truck that was held together by familiarity and stubbornness, and he charged almost nothing for his time because Margaret was gone and the money did not mean anything anymore. And what meant something was the work itself, the specific satisfaction of making a broken thing function again, of finding the place where the problem was hiding and bringing it into the light. Boyd Hardin had been one of his students, not formally, not in the curriculum program, but in the way that real teaching happens, which is in the specific moment when a specific person shows you a specific thing and you understand it so completely that it becomes part of how you see everything afterward. Everett had shown Boyd the secondary valve during a repair call on a neighboring property 7 years ago, crouching in the dirt with his flashlight while Boyd watched, and he had explained not just what the valve did, but why it was there, and what happened when it failed, and why it would not show up in any diagnostic scan, because the sensors that would flag it were positioned on the wrong side of the circuit to detect a downstream blockage. Boyd had absorbed this the way certain people absorb certain things completely and permanently. When Boyd called Everett on the morning of day 19, Everett had been drinking his first cup of coffee at the kitchen table with the radio on low. He listened to Boyd explain the situation without interrupting. He asked one question, which was whether the employer was someone worth working for. Boyd was quiet for a moment and then said he thought so, or he thought the man could become someone worth working for, which were different things, but both worth something. Everett said he would come in the morning. That evening, after Lorene had told him about the resignation letters and the notebook had been returned to the desk and the house had gone quiet, Harlan lay in the dark and made a decision that he had been building toward for 19 days without knowing he was building it. He made it the way he had made the decisions that had actually changed his life, not by analysis, but by the sudden clarity that comes when you have finally looked at something long enough to see it whole. He was going to get up at 6 in the morning. He was going to walk to the house at the end of the gravel drive before Boyd Harden had time to begin his day. He was going to knock on the door and ask Boyd Harden what he thought was wrong with the machine, and he was going to listen to the answer, and whatever Boyd said he was going to treat as the answer he had been waiting 19 days for. He was going to do this not because the notebook had told him to, and not because Lorene had told him to, and not because Tessa had asked the question he could not answer. He was going to do it because his father had known to do it and had tried to pass that knowledge forward, and Harlan had received it the way you receive something you are not ready for, which is to say, he had received it and set it down and walked away from it, and lived 37 years without ever finishing the last page. He was done not finishing things. The decision once made settled in him with the specific weight of something that had been held in suspension too long finally coming to rest. He felt it in his chest, in his shoulders, in the release of a tension he had been carrying so long he had stopped knowing it was there. It felt less like resolution than like recognition, the particular feeling of understanding something you have known your whole life and chosen not to examine. Harlan Whitfield was 62 years old. He had built something real from nothing, and he had done it through attention and work and the capacity to recognize what a situation required and respond to it without ego getting in the way. Except that somewhere along the way the ego had gotten in the way, and the place it had gotten in the way was so familiar that he had stopped seeing it as ego and started seeing it as method. He fell asleep before 1 in the morning, which was earlier than he had fallen asleep in 19 days. At 6:15 the next morning he put on his jacket and his boots and walked out into the cold Tennessee dawn with his breath showing in the air, and the frost still on the grass, and the light coming up pale and clean over the eastern ridge. He walked the length of the gravel drive to the small house at the end of it, and knocked on the door. Boyd answered in work clothes, coffee in hand, already dressed for a day that he had not yet been told would be different from any other. He looked at Harlan with an expression that was careful, and had been careful for a long time. Harlan stood on the step and did not do any of the things he might have done in the previous 19 days. He did not frame it as a consultation or a professional inquiry or a structured evaluation of available options. He stood on the step and he asked the question his father would have asked on the first morning. "Boyd," he said, "what do you think is wrong with it?" Boyd looked at him for a moment. The careful expression shifted, not to relief exactly, but to something adjacent to it, the expression of a man who has been waiting for a door to open and has finally heard the handle turn. Boyd told him, Secondary access panel left rear below the wheel housing. Small pressure regulation valve in a circuit that does not appear on standard service checklists. A blockage or a mechanical failure in that valve would choke off pressure to the drive system, while every upstream gauge continued to report correct function. No error codes because the sensors were on the wrong side of the failure to detect it. Every diagnostic scan would come back clean because every diagnostic scan was designed to look at the systems it was designed to look at, and nobody had designed a scan to look at a valve that everybody assumed was too fundamental to fail. Harlan stood in the cold morning air and listened to every word. When Boyd finished, Harlan nodded once. He said, "Call Everett Kane." Boyd looked at him. The careful expression was gone. What was there instead was simpler and more straightforward and had been waiting 19 days to be what it actually was. He said, "Yes, sir. I'll call him now." Harlan turned and walked back up the gravel drive toward the main house. The frost was melting in the early light, the field coming visible through the mist. The John Deere sitting where it had been sitting for 19 days. One more morning. Tomorrow would be different. He could feel the truth of that settling into him, with a certainty that had nothing to do with proof, the same certainty his father had carried in his hands when he put them flat on the earth and waited for what the ground had to say. The notebook was still on his desk. He would read it again tonight from the beginning, slowly. He would read all of it this time. There was no reason to think he had found everything his father had put in it. A man who paid that much attention would have put a great deal in, and a notebook that had waited in a box for 9 years could wait a little longer for the reading it deserved. But right now there was work to do and a machine to fix and a morning that had finally decided to be something other than the continuation of a very long failure. He walked into the house. Lorene was in the kitchen. She looked at him when he came in and read something in his face that made her stop what she was doing. He told her Boyd was calling Everett Kane. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he had seen before and always understood as the particular form of love that recognized a person most clearly at the moments when they were finally being honest with themselves. She handed him coffee. He took it and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the field and watched the mist lift off the grass, and felt for the first time in 19 days that the next morning would be the one that mattered. Everett Kane turned onto the property at 7:45 in the morning in a Ford F-150 that had been manufactured in 1993 and showed every year of it without apology. The paint had faded from whatever it had originally been to a color that was somewhere between blue and the memory of blue. The front bumper sat slightly lower on the passenger side from an encounter with the fence post that Everett had never bothered to address because the truck ran fine and the bumper still did what bumpers were supposed to do, which was to be in front of the truck. The bed held a toolbox that was longer than it was tall, dark metal dented in 3 places, with a latch that required a specific touch to open, the kind of specific touch that comes from 30 years of opening the same latch the same way. Harlan watched the truck come up the drive from the kitchen window. He had been up since 5. Lorene had made breakfast that neither of them had eaten much of. Boyd was already out by the equipment shed, visible from the window, as a figure in a work jacket standing in the cold morning with his hands in his pockets and his face turned toward the county road, watching for the same truck Harlan was watching for. There was something about the way the truck moved up the drive that Harlan noticed and did not have a word for at first. It moved without urgency. Not slowly exactly, but without the particular forward lean of someone arriving to perform, to demonstrate, to establish in the first 30 seconds that they were the person with the answer. It moved the way a working man moves when he has done a thing 10,000 times and the 10,001st time does not require ceremony. Harlan set down his coffee and went outside. Everett Kane stepped out of the truck with the careful economy of a man whose body had been used hard for 7 decades and had opinions about sudden movements. He was 71 years old, and he looked it in the way that certain men look their age, which is to say, he looked like everything he had done was visible in him, not as damage but as record. He was not tall. He wore canvas work pants and a heavy flannel shirt under an open jacket, and boots that had the same relationship to newness that his truck did. His hands when he reached out to shake Harlan's were the hands of someone who had spent a working life doing things with them. He shook Harlan's hand once briefly with the grip of a man for whom handshakes were acknowledgement rather than performance. Harlan started to explain the situation. The 19 days, the 5 technicians, the total spent. He had prepared a kind of summary in his mind during the sleepless hours of the previous night, the relevant facts organized in the order that would most efficiently communicate the scope of what had already been attempted. Everett listened for about 30 seconds, and then gave a small shake of his head. Not dismissive. More the gesture of a man redirecting unnecessary effort towards something more useful. He said Boyd had told him what he needed to know. He said he would like to take a look. That was the whole of it. He picked up his toolbox from the truck bed with one hand, the specific grip of a man who had carried that weight 10,000 times, and walked toward the field where the John Deere sat in the morning light. Boyd fell into step beside him at a distance that communicated respect without subservience. The two of them walked across the frost-softened ground toward the machine in a silence that was comfortable in the way that silence is comfortable between people who have an understanding. Harlan followed. He had spent 19 days directing operations, making calls, writing checks, managing the parade of expertise that had come and gone through this field. He had stood near each of the previous 5 technicians in the posture of the man who owned the problem and was overseeing its resolution. Now he found himself following 2 other men across his own field in the early morning, and the shift in his position felt appropriate in a way he could not have explained but did not question. Everett set his toolbox in the grass near the rear left of the machine and did not open it. He stood and looked at the tractor for a moment from a few feet away, the way a person looks at something before touching it, establishing a first impression based purely on observation. Then he walked around it slowly, one complete circuit, not touching anything, just looking. At the tires and their contact with the ground, at the hydraulic lines visible along the frame, at the undercarriage where it was visible, at the cab and the positioning of the controls, at the way the machine sat, which was level and showed no indication of frame stress or impact. He crouched at the front left wheel with the careful deliberateness of a man for whom crouching was a commitment, and he studied the undercarriage from that angle for a while without speaking. Then he moved to the rear to the right side and crouched again. He was reading something that Harlan could not read, some language written in the dirt patterns and the wear marks and the small accumulations of oil and soil that told a story about how the machine had been used and how it had responded to being used. Tessa had arrived the previous evening, driving up from Atlanta again to be there for whatever the next morning produced. She stood now near the fence with Lorene, both of them watching in the specific silence of people who have been waiting a long time and have learned not to hope too specifically. 3 ranch hands had gathered at the fence line as well. They had seen enough failed mornings over the past 3 weeks to have stopped expecting resolution, but something about this morning had brought them out some quality in the air, or in the word that had moved through the property overnight, that today was different. They watched without speaking. Everett straightened from his crouch and went to his toolbox and opened it with the specific touch the latch required. He took out a pressure gauge that was entirely mechanical, the kind with a dial face and a needle, no battery required, no digital display, no connection to anything except the port it was inserted into and the physical pressure of the fluid it was measuring. He had carried this gauge for a long time. The face was slightly yellowed and the case showed the marks of decades of use, but the needle moved cleanly and the calibration was accurate, which he checked against a reference point every few months out of professional habit. He connected it to the main hydraulic line and started the engine. The engine came alive with the same strong rumble it had produced every time anyone had started it in the past 19 days. Clean and powerful and giving no indication of any internal problem. Everett watched the pressure gauge needle for 2 minutes, tracking not just the reading but the way the needle moved, whether it was steady or had a tremor, whether the pressure built smoothly or in surges, what the behavior of the system was rather than simply what number the system reported. He cut the engine. He removed the gauge. He stood with one hand resting lightly on the rear panel of the tractor, not gripping it, just touching it with the flat of his palm, in the way that someone touches something when they are thinking rather than doing. Harlan stood nearby and did not speak. He had been practicing not speaking since he woke up that morning. Specifically, he had been practicing the kind of not speaking that was different from waiting for his turn to direct things, which was a discipline that did not come naturally to him, but that he recognized as necessary. Boyd stood on the other side of the machine, also not speaking, watching Everett with the attention of a man who had learned from this person before, and understood that the learning happened in the watching as much as in anything that was said afterward. Everett moved to the left rear of the tractor and crouched again. This time he stayed down. He was looking at a section of the lower frame where a small access panel sat close to the ground, partially obscured by the wheel housing in a position that required getting low and turning your shoulder sideways to see it clearly. The panel was small, smaller than a sheet of paper, and the 4 screws that held it in place were the same size as every other fastener on the machine and showed no indication of ever having been disturbed. Harlan had not known this panel existed. He suspected, watching Everett settle into position in front of it, that none of the 5 previous technicians had known it existed either. Or if they had known academically that there was a panel there, they had not known there was a reason to open it. The service checklist did not include it. The diagnostic software did not reference it. The training programs did not mention it because the man who wrote the training programs had considered what lay behind it too fundamental to require documentation. Everett took the flathead screwdriver from his toolbox and removed the 4 screws in sequence, setting each one in the grass in a small line so their order and orientation would be preserved for reassembly. He lifted the panel free and set it aside carefully and angled his flashlight into the space behind it. The flashlight was old, the kind that used 2D batteries, and had a lens that had been replaced once when the original cracked. The beam it threw was warm and steady. Everett held it in his left hand and leaned in close to see what it illuminated. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached his right hand into the space, working by feel as much as by sight, his fingers moving with the confidence of a man who has touched this kind of mechanism enough times to know what he is feeling before he can fully see it. He found the valve. He worked his grip around it and turned it slowly, feeling the resistance, assessing the nature of what was wrong. He withdrew his hand and looked at what he held. The valve was small, a component no larger than the span between his thumb and first finger. He held it up in the morning light and turned it slowly, examining it the way a jeweler examines a stone, with complete attention and without hurry. Then he extended his hand toward Harlan. Harlan stepped forward and took the valve and looked at it. He was not an engineer. He did not have the vocabulary to name what he was looking at in technical terms. But Everett pointed with one finger to the seal around the valve, housing a small ring of material that sat in a groove and created the compression that allowed the valve to function correctly. The seal was installed backward, not damaged, not worn, not degraded by age or contaminated by debris, simply installed in the wrong orientation, reversed from how it was designed to sit, so that the surface that was meant to face one direction faced the other. And the consequence of that reversal was that fluid could enter the circuit, but could not move through it in the proper direction, and volume and pressure backed up over hundreds of hours of operation until the accumulation was complete and the drive system lost the pressure it needed to function and the machine stopped. Every upstream sensor read perfect function because every upstream sensor was measuring a system that was functioning perfectly. The failure was in the one place that had no sensor, in a circuit that was not included in the standard diagnostic tree, behind a panel that was not on the service checklist inside a valve, that everyone who had been trained by the curriculum considered too elementary to check. It had been wrong since the day it was installed. Harlan looked at the valve for a long moment. He thought about the $1,850 he had paid Burl McKay. He thought about the $3,200 he had paid Denton Hale and the $4,800 that had gone to various visits and parts and diagnostic fees. He thought about the $500 Sheila Vance had refused to take more of because she could not in good conscience charge more for failing. He thought about Cody Marsh driving away without charging anything because the gap between what his equipment could find and what was actually wrong had been too large to invoice. $10,800 in 19 days to arrive at a seal installed backward in a valve the size of a small apple. He handed the valve back to Everett without speaking. There was nothing to say that would be useful, and Harlan Whitfield had spent 30 years in business learning that silence at the right moment said more than filling it. Everett took the valve and set it on the clean cloth he had pulled from his toolbox and picked up the wire brush. The bristles were worn down from decades of use, which meant they were the right stiffness for this kind of cleaning, firm enough to do the work and soft enough not to score the metal. He worked the brush through the valve passages with the patience of someone who understood that thoroughness here was not optional, not performing thoroughness, simply being thorough because the alternative was to leave something behind that would cause the problem to recur, and Everett Kane had not spent 57 years fixing things in order to fix them incompletely. He flushed the valve with solvent from a bottle in his toolbox and held it up to the light again and turned it in the beam, checking each passage for any remaining obstruction. He checked the seal itself, examined the groove it sat in, confirmed that the groove was clean and undamaged, and that the seal, once properly oriented, would create the compression it was designed to create. He reoriented the seal, He replaced it in the groove with his thumb, pressing it evenly into place, feeling for the resistance that indicated correct seating. He worked slowly around the circumference. Then he held the reassembled valve up one more time and turned it in the light, not because he doubted the work, but because a man who has done something correctly for 50 years checks his work, the same way a man who is still learning does, because the checking is part of the doing. He took out his Nokia and photographed the valve before reinstallation. The phone was older than the diagnostic software any of the previous technicians had brought, and it took photographs that were adequate rather than exceptional, but they were clear enough to show the orientation of the original seal and the corrected one side by side, which was what mattered. He said to Harlan without looking up from what he was doing that he was going to want those photographs. Harlan said he understood. Everett reinstalled the valve and replaced the access panel, returning each screw to the position it had come from, and tightening each one to the specific torque that he knew from experience was correct for this grade of fastener in this application. Not too much, not too little. The particular pressure that came from knowing rather than guessing. He closed his toolbox. He stood slowly, one hand on the frame of the machine for assistance, and Harlan did not reach out to help him because Everett did not appear to want help. He appeared to be rising at his own pace from his own decision, and the distinction mattered. Everett walked to the cab. He climbed in with the careful movements of a man whose body remembered every surface it had ever worked against and factored that memory into each new ascent. He settled into the seat and sat for a moment with his hands on the controls. Nobody spoke. Lorene had come down from the fence line and was standing in the field now near Tessa, both of them watching. The ranch hands were still. Boyd stood beside the rear wheel with his hands at his sides, his expression the particular stillness of a man who believes something is about to happen, but has been wrong before and is holding the belief carefully. Everett started the engine. The same rumble, the same clean, strong diesel sound that had been mocking everyone for 19 days by announcing a machine in perfect health that refused to move. The gauges came up. The hydraulic pressure read correct. The control system showed ready across every panel. Everett sat with both hands on the controls and did not engage them. He waited. Harlan watched through the cab window. The expression on Everett's face was not concern, and it was not uncertainty, and it was not the performance of calm that people produce when they are trying not to show that they are worried. It was simply calm. The genuine variety, the kind that comes from understanding what is happening and knowing that what is needed is time rather than action. Because Everett knew what the previous 5 technicians had not known or had not remembered or had not stayed long enough to observe. When a hydraulic circuit has been starved of proper flow for 19 days, the restoration of that flow is not instantaneous. Pressure must rebuild through the entire network, through every line and valve and actuator in the system. Fluid must move back into the spaces that have been sitting dry, and air that has settled into those spaces must be displaced, and the system must re-establish the equilibrium. It lost not in a single moment of failure, but over hundreds of hours of accumulation. The process takes time. Not much time, but time. A man who did not know this would interpret the stillness of those seconds as continued failure. He would reach for the controls again or climb down to check something or assume that the repair had not worked and the problem ran deeper. A man who knew this would sit with his hands on the controls and count to 30 and wait for the machine to remember what it was. Everett counted. Harlan did not know he was counting. He stood in the field and watched the back of Everett's head through the glass, and felt the seconds accumulate in a way that had physical weight, each one pressing down slightly harder than the last. He was aware of Laureen beside him without looking at her. He was aware of Tessa and Boyd and the ranch hands along the fence, all of them suspended in the same held breath. All of them having watched enough failure to have built walls around their hope that were now being tested by something that felt for the first time in 19 days like it might be different. The tractor moved, not dramatically, not with the surge of something proving itself. It moved the way a large thing moves when it wakes up slowly at first with the quiet authority of mass finding its momentum. The hydraulics came fully alive, pressure flooding through circuits that had been dormant actuators responding with the smooth certainty they had been built to deliver. The rear tires pressed into the Tennessee soil and found their purchase, and the machine rolled forward steady and powerful and entirely indifferent to the 19 days it had spent being everyone's problem. The ranch hand nearest the fence said something under his breath that was not quite a word. Tessa made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Boyd exhaled. It was not a short breath. It was the long, slow release of a man letting go of something he had been holding for 19 days, and it was audible, and nobody thought it was anything less than what it was. Laureen pressed both hands against her mouth, and her eyes were bright, and she did not say anything. Harlan stood in the October field and watched Everett Kane drive the John Deere 9R across ground that had been waiting for it, and he did not feel triumph. He had expected to feel something large and decisive, the satisfying completion of a long problem, the particular pleasure of a resolved tension. Instead, what he felt was smaller and more permanent than triumph. He felt the particular quality of a man who has finally understood something he should have understood earlier, and the understanding itself was both the reward and the cost, and the two could not be separated. Everett drove the length of the field. The full length, not a token demonstration, because the machine needed to move through its full range of operation to confirm that the repair was complete and not partial, and because a man who had spent 57 years fixing things understood the difference between fixing something and confirming it was fixed. He drove it back. The hydraulics responded cleanly to every input across the full run. The engine held strong. The drive system delivered exactly what it was designed to deliver. He brought the machine back to its original position and cut the engine. The field went quiet, the particular quiet that settles after something long and difficult is finished. Not the silence of failure which had a weight and a texture that everyone present had learned over 19 days. The open silence of completion, the silence that has room in it. Everett climbed down from the cab with the same care with which he had climbed up. He picked up his toolbox from the grass, confirmed that everything inside was in its place, and closed the latch with the specific touch it required. He turned around. Harlan was standing 10 feet away, not at the distance of someone overseeing a situation. Closer than that. The distance of someone who had something to say and had been composing it for the length of the field and back. He walked forward and extended his hand. Everett took it. The handshake lasted longer than the one that morning and meant something different. Harlan said that when Boyd first mentioned his name 3 weeks ago, he had nodded and moved on. He said he wanted to be honest about that. He said Everett's truck had pulled in that morning, and he had already formed an opinion based on what the truck looked like, and that the opinion had been wrong, and that forming it, had been a failure of attention that had cost him something more significant than the $10,800 he had spent getting to this morning. Everett listened. He did not shift his weight or look away or produce the expression of a man who is waiting for the other person to finish so he can respond. He just listened. When Harlan finished, Everett nodded once, the nod of a man who accepts something without making more of it than needs to be made. He said he appreciated that. 2 words that closed the account with the cleanness of a correctly tightened fastener and left nothing loose. Harlan was not finished. He said he had a question and he wanted an honest answer. Everett waited. Harlan asked him how it was possible that 5 certified technicians with advanced equipment had not found a seal installed backward behind a panel that a man with a flashlight found in under 2 hours. Everett was quiet for a moment, not because he did not have an answer, but because the answer required saying clearly, and he was composing it in the way he composed things precisely. He said that the technicians had looked at what their tools were designed to find. He said that diagnostic equipment was extraordinary at measuring what it was built to measure and completely blind to what it was not built to measure, and that the skill of using diagnostic equipment was inseparable from the limitation of it, because the better you became at following the data, the more thoroughly you learned which directions to look and which directions were not directions a person looked. He said the secondary panel was not in the checklist and not in the software and not in the training curriculum, and that absence had made it functionally invisible to anyone whose knowledge had come primarily through those channels. He said that none of those men were poor technicians. He said the problem was that their training had prepared them for everything except the thing that was actually wrong. Harlan asked how Everett had known to look there. Everett said he had known because he wrote the training curriculum that left it out. He said that was his own failure from 30 years ago, the assumption that something so basic did not need to be written down, and that every machine this problem had stopped since then was the consequence of that assumption. He said he had been fixing those consequences for years. He said it was the least he could do and also the only thing he could do at this point, which were sometimes the same thing. The honesty of that landed on Harlan with unexpected force. This man had driven 12 miles down a county road at the age of 71 in a truck held together by familiarity to correct a mistake he had made 30 years ago in a training document that nobody else even knew was the source of the problem. He had refused almost all payment for doing it because the money was not what this was about and had never been what this was about. Harlan said he wanted to offer him a position. Everett looked at him with the specific expression of a man who has heard this kind of offer before and has learned not to evaluate it based on the words alone. Harlan said he did not need a full-time mechanic. He said he needed someone who actually knew what they were doing, which was a different thing, and he said he was not using the phrase as flattery, but as a description of a gap in the operation of this property that had been present since the day he bought it, and that he now understood clearly enough to want to address. He said he wanted Everett to come 3 days a week, his own hours within reason, genuinely fair pay, meaning Everett would tell him what his time was worth, and that would be the number, not what Harlan thought sounded appropriate. Everett studied him with the gray eyes of a man who had seen too much to be impressed by the performance of generosity, and was evaluating the thing behind the performance. He said Harlan did not need a full-time mechanic. Harlan said he knew that. He said he needed someone to teach Boyd Harden what diagnostic software would never teach him. Something moved in Everett's expression. Not quite a smile. The recognition of a man being seen clearly by someone who had recently learned to look. He looked out across the field and back at Harlan and said he would think on it. Harlan said that was all he was asking. Lorene crossed the field toward them with the purpose of a woman who has been waiting her turn and has decided her turn has arrived. She introduced herself to Everett and shook his hand and thanked him not just for what he had done this morning, but for what the morning had cost him, in the particular way that meaningful mornings cost the people who make them possible. Everett said he had just done what needed doing. Lorene said he had done what four men could not do, and more importantly, he had taught her husband something he needed to learn, and she wanted him to know that was not a small thing in this house. Harlan did not argue with this, which was its own kind of statement. The morning moved toward midday. The ranch hands dispersed back to their work. Tessa took photographs of the tractor from several angles on her phone, not for any particular purpose, but because the documentation of a thing resolved felt like the right response to 3 weeks of documenting a thing failing. Boyd stood near the equipment shed with his hands in his jacket pockets and the expression of a man who has had something confirmed that he always knew but had not been certain he would live to see confirmed. Harlan walked to where Boyd stood. He told Boyd he owed him an apology. Boyd started to say something that would have been a gracious deflection, and Harlan stopped him. He said Boyd had known. He said he had told Harlan on the first morning, and Harlan had heard him and not listened, and the difference between those two things had cost 19 days and $10,800 and 3 letters Boyd had not sent, and whatever it had cost Boyd personally to stay through all of it, which Harlan suspected was more than Boyd would tell him if he asked directly. He said the reason he had not listened was not that Boyd had been wrong, it was that Boyd had not arrived with the credentials that Harlan's system required before it granted credibility. He said that was his failure, not Boyd's, and he wanted to say it directly because indirect acknowledgments of this kind of failure were a way of making the apology about yourself rather than about the person you owed it to. Boyd was quiet for a moment. He looked at Harlan with the clear eyes of a man who has been waiting 3 weeks to find out whether this version of the conversation was possible. He said he appreciated that. Harlan said that going forward, when there was a problem on this property, he was going to ask Boyd first, before he called anyone, before he opened a service contract or found a new technician or engaged any external resource. He was going to ask Boyd what he thought, and he was going to treat the answer with the weight it deserved. Boyd said he could work with that. Harlan said he thought they both could. The harvest ran through the rest of the week. It was late, and the window was narrower than it should have been, and the yield reflected 19 days of weather that had moved forward regardless. But the machines moved across the fields with the steady rhythm of work being completed. And there was something in that rhythm that felt like more than just the financial recovery of a delayed season. Harlan watched from his office window in the mornings and walked the fields in the afternoons and felt the property differently than he had felt it before, the way you feel a place differently once you understand something about it that you did not understand before. He had owned this land for 5 years. He had managed it as an asset, maintained it as an investment, directed it as a businessman, directs all his enterprises from the position of the person who sets the parameters and evaluates the outcomes. He had not known it. The distinction had not seemed relevant until recently. Everett Kane called 4 days after the repair before 7 in the morning, which Harlan had already identified as his hour. Harlan picked up on the second ring. Everett said he had thought about the offer. He said he would take it. 3 days a week, his own hours within reason. And he said he wanted to train Boyd, which was not a condition but a purpose, the thing that made 3 days a week worth the drive. Harlan said done. He asked when Everett could start. Everett said, how about tomorrow? The following morning Everett arrived to find Harlan and Lorene and Boyd and Tessa gathered near the barn. Tessa had driven up specifically for the occasion, which she had described to her mother as wanting to meet the man who taught her father humility, which she said with affection rather than irony. She stood slightly apart from her parents with her phone in her hand, not because she was planning to document anything formal, but because she had the instinct of her generation, which was that certain moments were worth keeping. Lorene had driven into town at 7 in the morning and come back with coffee and pastries from the bakery on the main street, and she had set them out on the tailgate of Harlan's truck with the quiet care she brought to any occasion she wanted to mark properly. Everett looked at the gathering with an expression that acknowledged it without being overwhelmed by it. He was not a man who needed ceremony, but he was a man who could recognize when ceremony was offered from the right place. They drank coffee and ate pastries in the cold morning air and talked about the property and the equipment and the season that was finishing and the one that would begin in spring, and the conversation had the quality of people finding the register of a relationship, rather than establishing it because the relationship had already been established in the field in the particular way that matters. Boyd showed Everett the maintenance shop that Harlan had spent 2 days reorganizing in anticipation of his arrival, a workbench along the full length of one wall, proper lighting, storage for tools organized by type and size, a space that communicated that the work done here was considered important, which was different from what the space had communicated before, which was that it was the place where equipment was stored when it was not being used for something else. Everett set his toolbox on the workbench and opened it and spent a few minutes arranging the tools in the configuration he preferred, which was not the configuration Harlan had assumed and which Harlan did not suggest changing. The work began. What Harlan observed in the weeks that followed was not primarily mechanical. The mechanical was real and had real consequences. Everett identified 3 other pieces of equipment running at suboptimal function for reasons that would have become expensive failures within a year, and the corrections were made efficiently and at a fraction of what they would have cost as emergencies. The harvest finished and the equipment was prepared for winter storage with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the decisions made in the off-season determined the options available in the working season. But what Harlan watched most was the space between Everett and Boyd. The manner in which knowledge moved between an older man and a younger one when both of them understood what the transmission was actually for. Everett did not lecture, he did not perform expertise. He worked, and Boyd worked beside him, and the teaching happened in the working in the specific moments when Everett would pause over a component and say something brief about what it was doing and what it would do if certain conditions changed, and how you could hear the difference before you could measure it. Boyd absorbed this the way he had absorbed everything Everett had taught him 7 years ago on a different property, crouching in the dirt beside a flashlight, completely and permanently, in the way that understanding goes into the hands rather than just the head. Harlan watched this from the doorway of the maintenance shop one afternoon in late November and felt the rightness of it settle into him in the way that things settle when they have found the place they were supposed to be. Everett noticed him watching and looked up from the work. He said, "Was there something Harlan needed?" Harlan said he just wanted to say thank you. For the day. For saying yes. For this. And he gestured at Boyd and the tools and the workbench and the whole arrangement of things that had come from one broken machine and 19 days and a notebook his father had written and a paragraph he had never gotten around to reading. Everett looked at him for a moment and then looked back at the work. He said there was nothing to thank him for. He said he got to work with his hands and pass on what he knew, and that was payment enough, regardless of what the actual payment was. Harlan said still. Everett nodded once and returned to what he was doing. One afternoon in December, when the fields were dormant and the equipment was stored and the year was settling into its quiet final weeks, Harlan drove alone in his truck south along the route toward Chattanooga, past the county where he had grown up, down roads he had not traveled in years past, the configurations of land and tree and fence post that had been the geography of his childhood. He drove without particular urgency in the way of a man on an errand rather than a mission. He turned onto the road that had once led to his father's farm. The property had changed, the buildings were gone, and the fields had been absorbed into the larger operation that had bought them. And the land looked like land that had forgotten a particular arrangement of things, which was not quite forgetting and not quite remembering, but something in the space between. He parked at the edge of the road where the old driveway entrance had been. There was nothing to mark it now except the angle of the tree line and the particular flattening of the shoulder that had once been where vehicles turned in. He sat in the truck with the engine off and his father's notebook on the seat beside him. He had read it 4 times since October. He had read it the way he should have read things his whole life, slowly and more than once, until what was in it became part of what he knew rather than just something he had been told. The last page still stopped him every time he reached it. Not with grief exactly. Grief was not the right word for what he felt reading his father's handwriting on a page that had been waiting 37 years for him to find it. The right word was something closer to recognition, the specific feeling of understanding something about yourself that you have known all along but required a particular arrangement of circumstances to finally see. He sat there for a while with the engine off and the December cold seeping in through the glass and his father's land visible through the windshield as land that had been other things and now was this. He thought about the morning he had knocked on Boyd's door. The simplicity of the question he had finally asked, the wait it had taken to ask it, the 19 days and $10,800 and 5 failed experts and 1 unread notebook that had been required to arrive at the capacity to ask a simple question of a person standing right next to him. His father had tried to give him this before he left, had pressed it into his hand with a handshake on a March morning in 1987, and trusted that it would take, that the boy with the good head would carry it forward into whatever Nashville would make of him. The boy had carried it forward in a box in a basement, which was not quite the same thing. He picked up the notebook from the seat beside him and opened it to the last page and read it again in the December light. His father's handwriting small and precise and slanting to the right. September 1987. A man who knew his son was leaving and knew he would not be able to say what needed saying in the way that would be heard, and so had written it down and trusted that eventually the reading would come. All the machinery in the world will not tell you what a good man standing beside you already knows. Harlan sat with that for a while longer. Then he closed the notebook and set it back on the seat and started the truck. The drive home took 40 minutes. He came up the county road in the early dark, with the lights of the property visible from a distance, the barn and the equipment shed and the maintenance shop with its new lighting showing through the window, and the small house at the end of the gravel drive where Boyd Hardin was probably sitting down to dinner. Lorene was on the porch when he pulled in a blanket around her shoulders against the cold, a cup of something warm in her hands. She watched him park and climb out of the truck and come up the steps. She said he looked like a man who had been somewhere. He said he had been out toward Chattanooga. Past the old property. She nodded. She had known him long enough to understand when a thing needed to be done without being explained, and when it did not. She handed him her cup, and he took it and stood beside her on the porch in the cold and looked out at the property in the dark, at the fields he owned and the equipment he had learned to understand differently, and the people he had learned to listen to. And he thought about his father standing on a driveway in March of 1987, shaking his son's hand and knowing there was no way to say everything that needed saying and saying it anyway in the brevity that was available. He had spent 37 years becoming the person his father had known he could become. He had done it in the wrong order, building the skills before understanding what they were, for mastering the method before learning its limits, finding the system that worked before learning what the system could not do. But he had gotten there. That was the thing his father had also believed, had written down in a notebook in 1987. Without knowing when or how or whether the reading would come, in the faith that a boy who paid attention when he was young would find his way back to paying attention when he was older, because that kind of attention does not leave a person. It just gets covered over by the things a man accumulates on his way to becoming who he is. It takes whatever it takes to uncover it again. Sometimes it takes a broken machine in 19 days and a man in an old truck who knows where to look. 30 years of building something from nothing had taught Harlan Whitfield how to find the right answer. 19 days in one broken machine had finally taught him where to look for it. His father had known all along, he just had not gotten around to reading the last page.